Soon, climate change will affect what all of us eat. That's according to Oxfam, the International Development Agency tasked with finding solutions to poverty and hunger. Oxfam has warned that governments are not prepared to deal with the food shortages that will arise from changing weather patterns. According to a major new scientific report, the impact will be felt much sooner and much more seriously than previously thought. We join now in the studio by Advisor for Economic Justice at Oxfam, South Africa. That's Rashmi. Mr. Rashmi, thank you very much for coming in.
Thank you.
Yeah, the problem of climate change is like a big thing now, and we can see the weather patterns changing a lot. You've done a report recently, done some lot of research, and you found some gaps. Which are the main ones? I mean, can you just take us through that very briefly?
Sure. Yes, climate change is making people hungry, and it's really pushing our fight against global hunger back by decades. What we're seeing from our latest report is that we're predicting that by the year 2050, 50 million more people will go hungry. Now 50 million more people means the population of South Africa. It also means that 25 million more children will be malnourished. Now, the briefing that we've produced has identified a series of gaps and failings, 10 gaps and failings in policy that mean that people are more at risk to climate-led hunger. Those failings and gaps, they include things like finance. So in order to protect crops and in order to protect people from the impacts of climate change, we need to adapt. And there is a massive gap in global finance available for adaptation, particularly for poor countries. Several years ago, rich countries said that they would provide the assistance, financial assistance for developing countries to adapt to climate change, but that is woefully short at the moment. It's to date, we've only seen about 2% of what's actually needed.
Are there gaps only in policy, or are they also in implementation? I mean, there's so many forums in the world today where climate change has been discussed and all kinds of resolutions taken and new agreements or pacts signed. I mean, is it in the implementation of whatever has been agreed upon that where governments are failing?
There is definitely a gap in implementation. Coming back to the finance issue, rich countries promised money, but they haven't delivered it. There are several other gaps in implementation at a global and a national level as well. For example, something that a lot of people don't think about is around gender and gender discrimination and what impact that has on food security, and particularly in the face of climate change. So, for example, South Africa claims to be a very good in terms of addressing gender. We have various constitutional policies that address gender. However, we see in this country that women don't have access to land, they don't have access to water, they don't have access to resources. Now, without this, they're not able to adapt to climate change because they can't invest in different practices in farming, for example, to protect their crops, to protect their livelihoods. Yet we know that women have a wealth of knowledge, indigenous knowledge. They are very connected to the land, particularly in rural areas and peri-urban areas, yet they are not allowed the decision-making power or the resources to be able to invest in land to protect and to adapt to climate change.
Yeah. Now, it's very difficult to predict weather generally. But with these weather patterns that are changing so much dramatically, weather forecasting, is it a gap as well?
It is, yes. Globally, it is a huge gap for many poor countries. So in our report, we talk about places like Chad, which have one weather station for 80,000 kilometers squared. In other areas in the US, for example, we'll see a weather station in about 8,000 kilometers squared. In South Africa, we do a little bit better as well. We're okay. We're not so bad. We've actually benefited from a number of years of weather stations around the country. But in many poor countries who desperately need that information, the information just isn't there. So when weather patterns are about to change, when we're expecting heavy rainfall or dry weather, for example, farmers need to know this. But if they don't know the information, they're not able to prepare.
Yeah. In Oxfam's research, very brief, and your experience on the ground, things like migration, we see a lot of people migrating from rural areas to urban areas. I mean, in urban areas, we rely on rural areas to produce the food for us. We also see a lot of instability, political instability, especially in and around several African countries. Do those play a factor in how we are addressing issues of hunger and poverty?
Well, climate change will impact on where people can stay and are able to survive, and so we will see migration from areas that suffer erratic weather patterns or extreme weather patterns, so people will start moving away from those areas, and yes, it will put pressure on cities where people expect to find more work, or other countries which people think are more secure in terms of weather. So we will over time see more and more people moving, and which will put pressure on other areas, definitely. The report, however, also talks about a number of other gaps, things like the gaps in irrigation. So in many countries in Africa, irrigation is very, very low for farming. Many farmers rely on rainfall for irrigation.
Which is now becoming erratic as well.
Exactly, and so once that becomes erratic, it becomes very, very hard for them to grow food. And so they go hungry, and everyone that depend on their food also go hungry. And that's how our hunger increases. And that's why we're saying it's a real problem, and that the world is woefully unprepared to deal with these problems now.
So more needs to be done urgently.
Absolutely.
Yeah, thank you very much. That's Economic Justice Manager at Oxfam in South Africa, Rashmi Mistry.
Know more about your world.
eNCA.com.